What if the greatest treasure of the Middle Ages was never stolen? What if it was never lost? What if, while kings and inquisitors stormed empty halls and broke open locked chests, the true wealth of the Knights Templar rested quietly underground, sealed by design? Imagine officials counting silver that felt too little. Imagine inventories that read like excuses. Imagine a military order famous for precision suddenly becoming careless with its most valuable assets. That silence has echoed for 700 years, and the question still lingers stubborn and uncomfortable. Where did the Templars put what no one ever found? So now you slow your breathing. The urgency eases. The torchlight dims just a little. The noise of accusations and trials fades into the background, and something quieter takes its place. Not chaos, not panic. Planning. Patience. Stone doors closing softly meant never to be reopened. You move closer to the mystery, not as a treasure hunter with a shovel, but as a listener willing to follow documents, absences, and strange consistencies. This is not a story about glittering relics pulled from the earth at the last moment. It is a story about what is missing, about careful men who built churches that doubled as fortresses, who measured land like bankers and thought in generations rather than seasons. When the arrests came in 1307, they came too cleanly, too efficiently, almost as if the order had already stepped aside, leaving behind just enough to satisfy the crown while something far more important slept beneath stone and soil. You can almost feel those places now. Cool air, the smell of damp limestone, footsteps that once echoed and then stopped forever. Somewhere between France's ruined keeps, forgotten rural houses, and coastlines where ships once waited in silence lies a pattern that has never been fully traced. And patterns, as you know, are never accidents. They are choices. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight is not about finding gold. It is about understanding why something was hidden so well that even failure could not expose it. And if you happen to drift a little while listening, that's perfectly fine. The vaults have waited centuries. They can wait a little longer with you. When the knock came in October of 1307, it arrived everywhere at once. Doors opened, seals were broken, chests were forced. Scribes dipped quills and wrote fast because this was supposed to be a clean sweep. A king does not accuse an order of unimaginable wealth unless he expects to take possession of it. And yet, when the lists were drawn up, they read strangely thin. Silver cups, modest reliquaries, vestments, horses, furniture. Useful things. Respectable things. Not the kind of things that justify years of whispered obsession and royal debt. You can picture the clerks pausing, glancing at one another, then continuing anyway. Official inventories from France describe assets that look more like those of a well-run monastery than the financial engine of crusades and kings. One well-established fact stands firm beneath the dust. Philip IV's agents did not record vast quantities of gold or silver bullion in Templar houses. That absence is not rumor. It sits plainly in surviving documents, stubborn and uncomfortable. What makes it more intriguing is that the order was known even by its enemies for logistical discipline. These were men who supplied armies across continents. They managed estates, loans, and transfers with a precision that made monarchs nervous. The idea that such an institution simply left its wealth lying around for seizure strains belief. It is like a modern bank leaving the vault unlocked during an audit and shrugging when asked about it. One might laugh if the consequences had not been so severe. There is an obscure detail buried in one French account that often slips past casual readers. In several commanderies, officials noted sealed rooms they were instructed not to open either because the keys were missing or because structural access was unclear. The phrase is frustratingly vague, almost lazy, as if the scribe wanted to move on to lunch. But that vagueness matters. It suggests not a thorough search, but a hurried one constrained by what was visible and convenient. The earlier sense of inventories that felt too little begins to sharpen here, like a stone under a thin mattress. You might ask yourself whether this was incompetence or something else. Royal officers were not amateurs. They knew how to confiscate property. They had done it before. Yet they seemed content to record what lay on the surface, to count what was handed over, and to accept locked absences as final. Some historians argue this reflects the practical limits of medieval searches. Others quietly wonder whether instructions were more selective than the records admit. The debate turns on intention. Did the Templars anticipate the arrests? The warrants were secret, yes, but rumors travel faster than parchment. There is evidence that certain houses were already sparsely occupied in the weeks leading up to the crackdown. Horses moved, brothers reassigned. In some places, valuables appear to have been consolidated earlier, long before any guards arrived. That timing has fueled an ongoing scholarly question: were the inventories incomplete because the wealth had already been relocated, or because it had never been stored there in the first place? You can almost hear the gentle sarcasm of history clearing its throat. An order accused of unimaginable riches turns out to possess tableware and spare cloaks. If this were a stage play, the audience would cough politely and wait for the real reveal. And yet the records end there, as if everyone agreed to stop asking. It is hard not to feel that something slipped past while attention was fixed on what could be counted. There is also the matter of regional inconsistency. In England, where the Crown was initially more cautious, inventories were even less dramatic. The Templars were treated as administrators, not villains, and the lists reflect that tone. This contrast raises an uncomfortable possibility. If wealth was evenly distributed, why do the seizures look uniformly modest across regions? And if it was concentrated, where exactly was that concentration located? The calm precision you sensed earlier now feels deliberate. The same order that planned supply lines to Jerusalem would not be surprised by political tides turning. Their architecture favored permanence. Their thinking favored redundancy. It is not unreasonable to imagine that their most valuable holdings were never meant to sit in obvious rooms, waiting to be logged by a nervous clerk with ink-stained fingers. At this point, you may find yourself smiling slightly, because the pattern is becoming familiar. Authorities arrive. They search. They write. And somehow the heart of the matter remains untouched, like checking a coat pocket while ignoring the locked suitcase by the door. One can hardly blame them. Medieval locksmithing was not known for convenience. Still, the silence that follows is telling. The open question remains unresolved and gently hums beneath the narrative. If the arrests failed to seize the order's true assets, where were those assets designed to be invisible? Were they moved hastily in the final days? Or had they been sleeping elsewhere all along, waiting out the storm like patient animals in winter? As you let that question settle, remember the image of stone doors closing softly. The sound does not echo. It absorbs, and perhaps that is the point. What was taken satisfied the immediate hunger of a king. What was not taken continues to satisfy curiosity centuries later. Not bad for a group supposedly caught off guard. Not bad at all. As the months passed and interrogations multiplied, another oddity emerged, quieter than missing gold, but perhaps more revealing. Royal agents began to report Templar houses that felt abandoned in spirit long before they were officially seized. Beds were made, chapels were intact, stables stood ready, and yet storage rooms echoed. Cellars that should have held surplus rents, emergency reserves, or long-term deposits offered only dust and orderly emptiness. The calm you sensed earlier now gains walls and corridors. There is a well-established historical fact that cannot be brushed aside here. Multiple royal audits describe commanderies with functioning infrastructure, but remarkably little stored wealth. These were not ruins or declining outposts. Many sat on productive land and had recently collected rents or tithes. Their emptiness was not the result of poverty. It was the result of absence. Something had been removed, or more intriguingly, something had never been kept there at all. One French record notes a house described as properly maintained, yet lacking its expected reserves. That phrase is polite, almost apologetic, but it carries weight. Medieval administrators knew what a normal commandery looked like. Grain stores fluctuated, yes, but a complete lack of accumulated assets raised eyebrows even then. You can almost picture the auditor pausing, scratching his beard, and choosing his words carefully. After all, this was not a mystery he was paid to solve. It was an inconvenience he was paid to document. An obscure but fascinating detail appears in a set of testimonies from brothers questioned later during the trials. Several mention that valuables were routinely transferred elsewhere for safekeeping without specifying where. The phrase appears more than once, always vague, always unhelpful. It is the medieval equivalent of saying something was put somewhere secure and expecting the conversation to end. Scholars still debate whether this reflects genuine ignorance among lower-ranking members or a disciplined refusal to speak plainly even under pressure. That debate matters. If ordinary brothers did not know where valuables were kept, then the absence of wealth from local houses becomes less suspicious and more systematic. It suggests a structure where day-to-day operations were deliberately separated from long-term storage. This aligns neatly with the earlier impression of inventories that felt incomplete and with those sealed rooms mentioned almost casually in official lists. The pattern is becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. You may notice how the tone of the records shifts over time. Early audits are clinical. Later ones grow terse, even irritated. Officials complain of delays, of unhelpful witnesses, of buildings that refuse to give up answers. There is a gentle irony here. The order accused of secrecy had trained its members to be discreet long before secrecy became a liability. When pressed, they offered obedience without revelation. It is hard not to admire the consistency even as it frustrates. A light joke slips in if you allow it. Imagine trying to inventory a modern office where everyone insists the important files are with headquarters, but headquarters never quite appears. You would eventually stop asking and file a report that says more by what it omits than by what it includes. Medieval bureaucrats were no different. They had deadlines, they had superiors, they moved on. Another point of scholarly contention lies in geography. The emptiest houses often appear in regions that were otherwise stable and profitable. This contradicts the idea that valuables were drained away only from threatened areas. Instead, it hints at a network-wide policy applied evenly regardless of local risk. Some historians argue this reflects centralized financial management. Others suggest it reflects preparation. The distinction is subtle but crucial. You can feel the investigation tightening now. Earlier, the question was whether anything was missing at all. Now the question is how absence was distributed so evenly. That distribution requires planning. It requires routes, schedules, and trust. And trust, once again, circles back to the idea that not everyone was meant to know everything. There is also the matter of timing. In several regions, audits conducted months apart show no change in the level of absence. Nothing new was discovered. Nothing new was recovered. The emptiness was stable as if frozen in time. If valuables had been moved in, panic traces would remain. Instead, what we see is consistency. The kind of consistency that makes you lower your voice instinctively because someone somewhere did their work very well. You might wonder whether later confiscations uncovered anything missed earlier. The answer, frustratingly, is no. Once the initial wave passed, subsequent searches yielded little of substance. The silence persisted. And silence, as you are beginning to sense, is the most expensive thing in this story. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be forced open. It simply waits. A gentle callback surfaces here almost without asking permission. Remember those stone doors closing softly. Imagine them not beneath grand fortresses, but beneath ordinary houses, fields, or chapels that continued their daily rhythms. Life above, secrecy below. It is an arrangement that has worked for centuries in other contexts. Why not here? The open question remains unresolved and continues to invite debate. Were these empty commanderies evidence of a vanished treasure or evidence that treasure was never meant to be stored? Where kings could reach it, the records do not answer. They merely point indirectly to a design that favored invisibility over defense. And invisibility, once achieved, is remarkably durable. As you settle into that thought, the pace naturally slows. The shock of arrest has faded. What remains is a quieter realization. The absence was not chaotic. It was calm, deliberate, almost serene. And serenity, as any good secret knows, is the hardest thing to break. By now, the silence has taken on weight. Empty houses, thin inventories, calm absences that refuse to behave like panic. The question quietly shifts almost without you noticing. Not where the Templars hid their wealth, but why they would design places meant not to be found at all. Because vaults are not simply holes in the ground. They are ideas made of stone. One well-established fact anchors this turn in the investigation. The Knights Templar were among the most sophisticated builders of fortified religious spaces in medieval Europe. Their commanderies were not improvised. They followed repeated patterns, thick walls, controlled access points, and a preference for durability over ornament. These were men who expected their buildings to outlive them. When an organization thinks that far ahead, storage stops being temporary and becomes strategic. Vaults in that context are not just about hiding valuables from thieves. They are about time. They protect against war, political collapse, and the inconvenient rise of hostile kings with unpaid debts. The order had already seen Jerusalem fall once. They had learned painfully that sacred places can be lost overnight. It would have been naive to assume Europe was immune to similar upheaval. An obscure but revealing detail appears in internal Templar regulations that discuss custody and transfer. They emphasize layered responsibility, with assets often entrusted to places rather than people. This distinction matters. People can be arrested. Buildings, especially unremarkable ones, tend to be ignored. Scholars continue to debate whether these rules were purely administrative, or whether they reflect a deeper philosophy of concealment. The language is careful, almost minimalist, as if the less said, the better. If you let yourself imagine it, the logic becomes almost soothing. Wealth stored in obvious treasuries invites attention. Wealth divided and hidden invites forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is a kind of armor. The earlier image of clerks counting cups and cloaks begins to look less like failure and more like success. The system worked exactly as designed. It just did not work for the people holding the quills. There is also the matter of what the vaults were meant to hold. Popular imagination leaps immediately to gold, silver, and relics. But medieval wealth was broader and quieter. Charters, deeds, debt records, letters of credit, documents that could reshape power if revealed at the wrong moment. Hiding these would have been far more important than hiding coins. A chest of silver can be replaced. A ledger proving royal obligation cannot. Some historians argue that the very idea of secret vaults is an anachronism, a projection of modern thinking onto medieval minds. Others counter that the Templars, uniquely among their peers, operated across borders and legal systems, forcing them to innovate. The debate remains open, but the pattern of absence you have been following leans gently toward intention rather than accident, especially when you recall how evenly that absence appeared across regions. A soft callback settles in here, almost like a familiar melody. Remember the testimonies where brothers spoke of valuables being transferred for safekeeping without detail? If vaults existed primarily to protect documents and strategic assets, it makes sense that only a few would know their locations. It also makes sense that those few would choose their words carefully when questioned. Silence, after all, is easier to maintain than a lie. This is one of those moments where history feels oddly modern. You might smile at a small, sleepy joke drifting through the narrative. Imagine designing the world's most secure filing system and then refusing to label the folders. Annoying for auditors. Wonderful for longevity. The Templars intentionally or not seem to have mastered this approach. Another layer emerges when you consider theology. Medieval religious orders believed deeply in stewardship. Wealth was not owned. It was held in trust. Protecting it for future use, even beyond the lifespan of the order itself, could be framed as a moral duty rather than greed. This perspective complicates the common caricature of hidden treasure as selfish hoarding. It reframes vaults as inheritance boxes meant for a future that never arrived, or perhaps has not arrived yet. The ongoing scholarly question circles quietly here. Were these vaults designed with a specific catastrophe in mind, or were they a general precaution refined over decades? The sources do not speak clearly. They rarely speak at all. And yet the consistency of architectural practice combined with the systematic absence of assets suggests forethought that goes beyond routine administration. As you rest with this idea, the atmosphere shifts again. The story is no longer about frantic concealment under threat. It is about patience, about structures built to wait. Stone chambers that do not care who rules above them or which banners fly in the wind. They simply remain. The investigation has now moved underground conceptually, if not physically. Earlier, you stood in empty halls and read thin inventories. Now you are thinking like the builders themselves, considering what they feared most and how they planned to survive it. The answer seems less dramatic than legend and somehow more impressive. They did not rely on secrecy alone. They relied on time. And time, as you can feel in your slowing breath, is the one resource that has never run out for this mystery. By this point, the idea of deliberate design has settled in steady and convincing. Now the focus drifts from documents to stone, from ink to foundations. Because buildings remember things that people forget, and some of the places associated with the order seem to remember more than they reveal. There is a solid, well-established fact that frames this part of the investigation. Templar architecture followed recognizable patterns across Europe, especially in their fortified houses and urban compounds. Thick walls, narrow access points, controlled circulation, and an emphasis on internal security recur again and again. These were not decorative choices. They were functional decisions made by men who thought in terms of defense and endurance. When you see the same design instincts repeated across regions, it becomes reasonable to ask what those instincts were protecting. At several surviving sites, archaeologists have noted structural anomalies that do not align neatly with the visible layout. Floors that sit slightly higher than expected, staircases that end too soon, walls that appear thicker than their load-bearing role requires. On their own, each feature can be explained away as a quirk of medieval construction. Together, they begin to feel like intentional irregularities, like punctuation marks in stone. An obscure but intriguing detail comes from modern surveys conducted with non-invasive techniques. In more than one former Templar location, ground-penetrating scans have revealed voids beneath known structures. Not tunnels, not crypts in the usual sense, but sealed cavities with no obvious access from above. Scholars disagree on their purpose. Some argue they were drainage features or collapsed cellars. Others quietly admit that the shapes and placements are unusual, especially given how carefully the surrounding masonry was executed. This is where the investigation deepens rather than widens. Remember the earlier realization that valuables may never have been stored in obvious places at all. If vaults existed, they would not announce themselves with doors and hinges. They would be integrated into the structure so completely that later generations would walk over them without noticing. Medieval builders were capable of this kind of subtlety. Cathedrals are full of hidden passages, sealed chambers, and symbolic spaces disguised as structural necessities. One detail that continues to provoke debate involves floor plans that show symmetrical layouts disrupted by a single irregular chamber. In ordinary monasteries, such asymmetry often reflects later modifications. In Templar sites, however, some of these irregularities appear original. That distinction matters. It suggests planning rather than improvisation. Planning implies purpose, and purpose implies intent beyond simple habitation. You might feel a faint smile forming at the idea that a group known for secrecy would hide things in plain sight. There is a gentle humor in imagining centuries of visitors admiring a chapel floor while something important rests quietly beneath their feet. No guards, no traps. Just trust in time and human distraction. History's favorite accomplice. A soft callback hums here, connecting back to the empty commanderies you visited earlier. Those buildings felt intact, functional, yet oddly hollow. Architecture offers a possible explanation. If long-term storage was never meant to be above ground, then emptiness was not a sign of removal. It was the intended state. Daily life unfolded on the surface while permanence settled below. There is also the question of access. If vaults were sealed deliberately, how were they meant to be reached? Some historians suggest temporary access points that were closed once their purpose was fulfilled. Others propose knowledge-based access, where only specific measurements or alignments revealed an entrance. This idea may sound fanciful, but medieval builders regularly incorporated symbolic geometry into their work. Alignments with feast days, solstices, or specific architectural markers were not unusual. The debate remains unresolved, but it highlights how easily modern eyes can miss cues that medieval minds took for granted. One of the more controversial interpretations argues that certain Templar chapels were designed as decoys, visually impressive, yet structurally straightforward, while the real complexity lay elsewhere on the same property. This would align neatly with the pattern of false trails hinted at earlier. If true, it means generations of observers have been looking at the right places in the wrong way. A comforting thought for anyone who enjoys a mystery that refuses to yield easily. A light, sleepy joke drifts in here because it feels earned. Imagine hiding your most important possessions under the floor, and then spending centuries watching people argue about the wall color. The vault, if it exists, would be very patient by now. The open question that lingers concerns scale. Were these architectural features meant to conceal small, highly valuable caches, or something larger and more systematic? The absence of confirmed discoveries keeps the debate alive. Yet the consistency of design choices across regions suggests coordination rather than coincidence. This echoes the earlier sense that the order thought in networks, not isolated houses. As you sit with this, the atmosphere grows quieter. Stone absorbs sound. It keeps secrets without effort. The more you consider the buildings themselves, the less dramatic the idea of hidden vaults becomes. It feels practical, sensible, almost boring, which in historical mysteries is often a sign that you are close to the truth. You are no longer chasing legends of glittering treasure rooms. You are listening to walls, floors, and measurements that were meant to last longer than accusations. The story has slowed again, settling into the rhythm of masonry laid by hands that expected no applause. They built to endure. And endurance more than secrecy may be the most important clue of all. The focus now drifts toward a place that should have answered everything, and instead deepened the silence. The temple in Paris was not a remote outpost or a rural afterthought. It was the heart, the administrative core, the place where kings' borrowed messengers arrived and records were meant to converge. If hidden vaults existed anywhere, logic suggests they would have left fingerprints here. And yet this site remains one of the most frustrating blanks in the entire investigation. A well-established historical fact anchors the mystery. When Philip IV ordered the arrest of the order, the temple complex in Paris was seized intact. It was heavily guarded, carefully searched, and later dismantled piece by piece. Contemporary descriptions confirm that officials expected to find immense wealth there. What they actually recorded was modest, functional, almost disappointing. This discrepancy has bothered historians for generations because the temple was not just another house. It was where the order stored royal deposits and managed its most sensitive affairs. The keep itself, often referred to as the Great Tower, was an imposing structure with multiple levels and unusually thick walls. Medieval chroniclers remarked on its solidity, noting that it was designed more like a fortress than a residence. That design choice alone invites questions. A building meant to intimidate also conceals. Thick walls are excellent at hiding things that do not wish to be found. When you picture officials walking those corridors, you begin to understand how easily something essential could remain invisible. An obscure detail appears in later demolition records long after the order was gone. Engineers tasked with dismantling the tower commented on the difficulty of the work, mentioning dense masonry and unexpected internal divisions. These notes are technical and dry, yet they hint at a structure more complex than its outward form suggested. Some scholars argue this complexity was purely defensive. Others quietly wonder whether it served a secondary purpose that never made it into official inventories. The debate becomes sharper when you consider timing. Several sources note that wagons were seen leaving the temple shortly before the arrests. The descriptions are vague and frustratingly unspecific, the medieval equivalent of saying some vehicles went somewhere. Critics dismiss this as rumor. Supporters counter that even rumors deserve attention when they align so neatly with documented absences. The open question remains unresolved. Were these movements routine transfers or part of a final consolidation before the storm broke? A gentle callback surfaces here, linking back to earlier reflections on planning and patience. The order had no reason to keep everything in one place. Concentration invites catastrophe. Distribution invites survival. If the temple served as an administrative hub rather than a storage hub, then its emptiness begins to make sense. The true assets may have already been sleeping elsewhere far from royal reach. There is also the matter of what lay beneath. The temple complex included cellars, sublevels, and service spaces that were never mapped with modern precision before their destruction. Once the buildings were gone, so too was the opportunity for careful examination. Later, urban development buried the past under layers of streets and apartments. It is one of history's quieter jokes that the most important clues are often removed in the name of progress. One imagines the vault, if it existed, sighing softly as the city grew above it. Some historians suggest that the temple's role has been exaggerated, that its symbolic importance has overshadowed its practical function. Others argue the opposite, insisting that symbolism itself was part of the strategy. A conspicuous headquarters draws attention away from quieter sites. It becomes the place everyone expects to find answers, ensuring that disappointment feels final. This interpretation remains controversial, but it aligns uncomfortably well with the pattern of decoys hinted at earlier. You might allow yourself a small, sleepy smile here. Imagine the frustration of a king who dismantles an entire fortress brick by brick, only to confirm once again that the real prize is not there. It is the historical equivalent of emptying a safe and finding only receipts. Impressive receipts, perhaps, but still receipts. Another obscure thread appears in later Parisian folklore. Stories persisted for centuries about tunnels and hidden chambers beneath the old temple grounds. Most are dismissed as urban legends, born of nostalgia and imagination. Yet such stories often sprout where official explanations feel thin. They are not evidence, but they are symptoms. They signal that even contemporaries felt something unresolved, lingered beneath the surface. The scholarly debate now circles a delicate point. If the temple did contain hidden vaults, why were they never discovered during demolition? Some propose that any such spaces were so thoroughly integrated into the structure that they were destroyed without recognition. Others suggest that the vaults were never there at all, and that the temple's emptiness proves the strategy of dispersal was complete. Both positions have merit, and neither can close the case. As you sit with this uncertainty, the atmosphere grows dense like the air in a stone basement. The temple in Paris becomes less a location and more a symbol. It represents expectation unmet, authority frustrated, a reminder that power does not guarantee access to everything it desires. The calm precision you sensed earlier now feels almost mischievous. You are left with an image that refuses to settle. A massive tower searched, seized, and destroyed, yet somehow still holding its secrets. Whether those secrets lay beneath its floors or had already slipped away, the result is the same. The center yielded nothing, and sometimes in historical investigations, nothing is the loudest answer of all. Away from towers and royal attention, the story grows quieter, and in that quiet patterns become easier to hear. Rural commanderies rarely appear in popular retellings, yet they formed the backbone of the order's daily existence. These were not places of ceremony or spectacle. They were farms, storehouses, and waypoints along roads that mattered only to those who used them regularly. If something was meant to endure unnoticed, these locations offered the perfect cover. A well-established historical fact anchors this shift in focus. The majority of Templar properties were rural, scattered across countryside, that produced steady income through rents, agriculture, and tolls. These houses were expected to maintain reserves to survive bad harvests or supply distant campaigns. Royal auditors knew this. That is why their repeated surprise at finding so little stored wealth in these places is so telling. Absence in the countryside cannot be explained by rapid flight or panic. It suggests routine. Several trial records mention commanderies described as orderly, yet bear a phrase that echoes earlier observations, but takes on new meaning here. In isolated locations, officials had time. They searched more slowly, and still they found nothing beyond what daily life required. An obscure but compelling detail emerges in a handful of depositions, where local tenants claimed they had seen goods moved at night months before the arrests. These statements are often dismissed as hearsay, yet their consistency across regions keeps them from fading entirely. Scholars debate whether these movements represented consolidation toward safer sites or dispersal toward deeper concealment. The distinction matters. Consolidation implies vulnerability. Dispersal implies confidence. When you recall how evenly emptiness appeared across the network, dispersal feels more plausible. It aligns with the earlier sense that valuables were not being chased from place to place, but guided calmly into positions already prepared. Here, the earlier architectural observations return softly. Rural buildings offered flexibility. They could hide features without drawing notice. A reinforced cellar beneath a granary would attract far less attention than a fortified vault beneath a tower. Stone and earth in the countryside were already associated with storage. Adding another layer of secrecy would not stand out. It is the historical equivalent of hiding a page inside a book on a crowded shelf. There is also the human factor. Rural commanderies were staffed by fewer brothers, often men deeply familiar with their surroundings. Trust networks mattered more here than hierarchy. If vault access required local knowledge rather than formal rank, it would explain why later interrogations produced so little clarity. Those questioned may genuinely have known nothing beyond their immediate duties, or they may have known enough to stay silent without feeling dishonest. A light, gently amused thought drifts through the narrative. Imagine interrogating a farmer knight about hidden wealth and receiving an answer about crop rotations. Both could be true. Both could be distractions. History rarely clarifies which is which. Another obscure detail appears in land records that continued after the order's dissolution. Some former Templar properties changed hands without any mention of recovered assets, even decades later. If hidden wealth had been discovered accidentally during routine farming or construction, it would likely have sparked documentation or dispute. The silence suggests either remarkable luck or remarkable concealment. Scholars remain divided, and the question remains open. You might recall the image of wagons leaving the temple blurred and unspecific. In rural contexts, movement would have been even less noticeable. A cart on a country road attracts no attention. Over time, repetition turns into invisibility. The calm precision sensed earlier feels especially at home here, in landscapes that reward patience rather than force. The narrative begins to feel almost pastoral, and that is deceptive. Beneath fields and barns may lie the most durable expressions of the order's planning. Cities change. Towers fall. Countryside endures. This realization shifts the investigation subtly but decisively. The most important places may never have looked important at all. The open scholarly question hums gently beneath the surface. If vaults existed in rural commanderies, were they meant to be temporary refugees or permanent guardians? Were they intended to be reopened by a surviving remnant, or simply to remove dangerous assets from circulation altogether? The sources do not answer. They only suggest that whatever was done, it was done quietly, repeatedly, and without leaving obvious scars. As you rest with this thought, the pace slows again. Fields stretch, roads wind. The drama of arrests feels distant. What remains is a sense of deliberate understatement. Wealth hidden where no one expects wealth to matter. power expressed through absence rather than display. It is not romantic. It is effective. And effectiveness more than legend is what ties these disappearances together. The rural houses did not lose something. They were never meant to hold it. The story, once again, is not about what vanished, but about where nothing was ever allowed to appear. The investigation now drifts toward the edge of land, where certainty thins and imagination tends to swell. Ships invite stories. Horizons encourage speculation. And for centuries, the idea that the order moved its most sensitive assets by sea has tempted both scholars and romantics. The challenge is to separate what fits the historical record from what merely floats. A well-established fact grounds this inquiry before it drifts too far. The Knights Templar operated one of the most effective maritime networks of their time. They owned and chartered ships, maintained ports, and moved men and supplies across the Mediterranean with remarkable efficiency. This was not incidental. It was essential to crusading logistics. Any serious examination of hidden vaults must therefore consider whether the sea offered not just transport, but concealment. Several medieval sources confirm that Templar vessels were active in the months leading up to the arrests. This alone proves nothing. Yet it aligns uncomfortably well with earlier hints of quiet movement. An obscure detail appears in a handful of port records, noting departures without corresponding arrivals. The entries are frustratingly brief, more accounting shorthand than narrative. Some historians dismiss them as clerical gaps. Others argue that such gaps are precisely where intentional secrecy would hide unnoticed among routine omissions. The debate intensifies when coastal commanderies enter the picture. These sites combined land-based storage with maritime access, creating natural transition points. If assets were being relocated to more permanent hiding places, these locations would have been ideal staging areas. Yet once again, inventories from these houses fail to show evidence of large accumulations. The pattern of absence persists now, stretching from inland fields to the shoreline. It is tempting to imagine island vaults, sealed caves, or hidden harbors where wealth waited behind stone and salt. Some theories point to specific islands, others to anonymous stretches of coast. Most falter under scrutiny. There is little evidence that the order invested in long-term fixed storage offshore. Permanent vaults require maintenance, access, and trust. Salt air is not kind to documents, metals, or masonry. The sea excels at movement, not preservation. A more restrained interpretation has gained quiet support among historians. Rather than imagining maritime vaults as destinations, they see ships as tools of redistribution. The sea allowed assets to be spread thinly placed beyond the reach of any single authority. This interpretation aligns neatly with earlier observations of dispersal rather than consolidation. It also explains why no dramatic discoveries have emerged from coastal digs. The ships did their work and moved on. A soft callback settles in here, echoing the rural commanderies you visited not long ago. Just as carts on country roads attract little-noticed ships in busy ports, blend into routine. Movement becomes invisibility when it is common enough. The order did not need secrecy at sea. It needed normality. And normality, as history often shows, is far more effective. There is also the human factor to consider. Sailors, unlike knights, lived transient lives. Their loyalty was often contractual rather than ideological. This raises an open question that scholars still debate. Would the order have trusted maritime crews with knowledge of sensitive transfers? Some argue that compartmentalization would have limited exposure. Others suggest that only the fact of movement mattered, not the nature of what was moved. A sealed crate looks the same whether it holds grain or records. A gentle, sleepy joke drifts through the waves here. Imagine asking a medieval dockworker what was in a crate from a century ago. You would be lucky to get the right century. Memory, like the tide, moves on quickly. One obscure account describes a Templar ship unloading at night at an otherwise unremarkable harbor, then departing without ceremony. The source is late and second-hand, which makes it unreliable. Yet it persists in the literature because it feels plausible rather than spectacular. No treasure, no drama, just logistics. That tone matches everything else you have encountered so far. Critics of maritime theories point out a practical concern. If assets were moved repeatedly by sea records would exist somewhere. Insurance provisioning port fees. The lack of clear documentation troubles them. Supporters counter that the order often bundled activities under generic entries masking specific purposes. The debate remains unresolved, balanced between skepticism and quiet acceptance. As the sea fades back into the background, a realization settles gently. The maritime network does not offer a final hiding place. It offers something subtler: flexibility. The ability to respond calmly when political weather changes. Ships do not need vaults. They need destinations that no one thinks to search. The earlier image of stone doors closing softly now feels different. Perhaps some of those doors were never meant to close permanently. Perhaps they were opened, used, and sealed again as part of a larger rhythm. Land holds, sea moves. Together they form a system that leaves remarkably little behind. The open question lingers like a distant lighthouse. Did the sea play a decisive role in removing assets from danger? Or was it simply one thread in a much larger strategy of disappearance? The evidence does not shout. It whispers, consistent with everything else. The order did not trust in one solution. It trusted in many small ones, layered and forgettable. As you let the waves recede, the investigation feels steadier, not looser. The maritime theories, once stripped of romance, reinforce the same calm conclusion. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was dramatic. And that more than any legend is what makes the silence so convincing. By now, absence has stopped feeling accidental. It has rhythm. And rhythm in historical systems usually points to rules. Not written for outsiders, but understood, internally repeated, until they no longer needed explanation. The investigation turns inward here, away from places and toward behavior, because secrecy is not built with stone alone. It is built with habits. A well-established historical fact grounds this shift. The Knights Templar operated under one of the most structured rule systems of any medieval order. Their regulations governed speech movement, correspondence, and obedience with remarkable precision. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was practiced. Brothers were trained to speak little, to report upward rather than outward, and to accept that some knowledge was not theirs to hold. This culture alone would have made large-scale concealment possible. Within those rules, there are subtle phrases that have attracted scholarly attention. Certain instructions refer to matters handled by command, without elaboration, or to decisions made where it is fitting a phrase that appears deliberately vague. An obscure interpretation suggests this language functioned as a verbal seal, signaling that explanation was neither required nor permitted. Critics argue this is reading too much into formulaic phrasing. Supporters counter that repetition of ambiguity across contexts hints at intention. You can feel the investigation narrowing here. Earlier, the focus was on missing objects and empty rooms. Now it is on missing explanations. When brothers questioned during trials gave answers that were technically truthful, yet practically useless, It frustrated interrogators, but revealed something important. They were not improvising. They were staying within a mental framework that valued obedience over disclosure. That framework does not emerge overnight. A soft callback emerges, linking back to testimonies where assets were said to be transferred for safekeeping. The phrase now sounds less evasive and more procedural. It reads like internal shorthand understood within the order and meaningless outside it. That kind of language is a powerful tool. It allows action without narrative execution, without justification. There is also evidence of compartmentalization. Not everyone did everything. Not everyone knew everything. Certain offices handled correspondence. Others handled logistics. Others still managed land and revenue. Scholars continue to debate how far this separation went. Was it simply efficient administration, or was it a deliberate barrier against compromise? The open question remains unresolved, but the pattern fits neatly with the broader absence you have been tracking. A light, almost sleepy humor slips in here. Imagine an organization so disciplined that even under torture its members mostly complain about discomfort rather than reveal useful details. It is not heroism. It is training. Boring, repetitive, deeply effective training. Another obscure detail comes from how records were kept. Templar documentation favored brevity. Transactions were recorded without flourish, often without contextual explanation. Modern historians find this maddening. Medieval administrators likely found it reassuring. Less context meant less vulnerability. A document that cannot be misinterpreted cannot betray you. At least that seems to have been the philosophy. Critics of intentional secrecy argue that medieval bureaucracy was simply inefficient and that we mistake chaos for design. This argument has merit, yet chaos rarely produces consistent silence across regions, roles, and decades. Design does, especially when reinforced by shared values and daily practice. The investigation now touches something quieter and more unsettling. If vaults existed, secrecy would have required not just physical concealment, but cultural reinforcement. The order appears to have possessed both. Rules taught restraint. Language limited curiosity. Obedience replaced explanation. Over time, this would create an environment where even participants could act without fully understanding the whole. You may notice how calm this feels. There is no frantic destruction of records, no dramatic burning of papers. Secrecy here is passive. It does not fight exposure. It simply never offers itself. Like a locked door that does not need guarding because no one knows it exists. The ongoing scholarly debate circles one central question. Was this culture of restraint designed with a specific secret in mind? Or was it a general posture that happened to serve concealment well? The answer matters less than the outcome. When pressure came, the system held. Questions met silence. Searches met emptiness. As you settle into this realization, the pace slows again. Breathing evens out. The noise of accusation fades further. What remains is a sense of quiet confidence. The order did not rely on luck. It relied on structure. And structure, once internalized, survives even when buildings fall and names are erased. The investigation has now revealed something essential. If vaults were never found, it may be because they were protected by the most durable barrier imaginable. Not stone, not distance, but people trained not to tell stories. At this point, the silence begins to feel selective. Not everyone was quiet in the same way. Some knew less. Some likely knew more. And in organizations built on hierarchy, that difference matters. The investigation now turns toward the narrow band of men whose positions placed them closest to whatever was never meant to surface. A well-established historical fact provides the frame. The Knights Templar were rigidly hierarchical. Authority flowed downward from a small group of senior officials who controlled finance, logistics, and strategic decisions. Ordinary brothers followed rules. Commanders executed orders. Only a handful sat at the junction where information converged. If hidden vaults existed, it is here among this inner circle that their locations would have been decided and remembered. Trial records offer a curious pattern. Lower-ranking members, when questioned, tended to provide detailed accounts of daily routines, possessions, and practices. Senior figures, by contrast, spoke less and said less. Their answers were brief, procedural, and carefully bounded. Some historians interpret this as guilt. Others see something more mundane and more convincing. These men were trained administrators. They understood how much language mattered. They did not volunteer context. An obscure but telling detail appears in the way certain high-ranking officials referenced decisions. They often attributed actions to collective authority rather than individual judgment. Phrases equivalent to it was "so ordered" appear repeatedly without naming who ordered it. This diffusion of responsibility frustrates modern readers, but it served a purpose. When no single person owns a decision, no single person can betray it. A soft callback surfaces here, echoing the earlier theme of compartmentalization. If only a few knew where the most sensitive assets rested, and if those few shared knowledge sparingly even among themselves, then the system would be remarkably resilient. Arrest 1. Silence remains. Arrest several. Silence still remains. It is not secrecy enforced by fear. It is secrecy embedded in structure. Scholars continue to debate how explicit this knowledge was. Did senior officials possess detailed maps and instructions, or did they operate through routines and signals that required no written record? Some argue that medieval organizations depended heavily on memory and ritual. Others counter that finance at this scale required documentation. The open question remains unresolved, balanced between human limitation and institutional discipline. There is also the uncomfortable matter of mortality. Many senior Templars died during imprisonment or execution. If vault knowledge rested only with them, it may have died as well. This possibility complicates romantic visions of hidden treasure awaiting rediscovery. It suggests something quieter and more tragic. Secrets designed to outlast danger may still perish if the chain of memory breaks. A gentle, dry humor slips in here because it feels almost necessary. Imagine guarding a secret so effectively that even you eventually forget who else knows it. Organizational success can sometimes look like historical disappearance. Another obscure clue lies in post-dissolution careers. A few former Templar officials transitioned into other religious or administrative roles. None are known to have revealed dramatic information about hidden assets. This absence has fueled speculation that either they knew nothing specific or that their loyalty outlived the order itself. Both interpretations carry weight, and neither can be proven. The narrative now tightens around a subtle realization. Vaults, if they existed, were not protected by universal knowledge. They were protected by scarcity of knowledge. The fewer who knew, the fewer who could talk. This principle echoes through everything you have encountered so far, from empty houses to vague inventories to calm testimonies. It is the same shape repeating. The investigation does not conclude that a grand council of knights gathered to hide treasure in a single dramatic act. It suggests something far less cinematic and far more effective. Decisions made quietly over time by men accustomed to thinking beyond their own lifespans. Places chosen not because they were clever, but because they were forgettable. The open scholarly debate lingers like a low candle flame. Was there a final repository whose location died with its keepers, or was knowledge deliberately fragmented, so no one person ever held the whole? Either way, the result is the same. No map emerged. No confession unlocked the stone. As you rest with this, the atmosphere grows subdued. The investigation has shifted from searching landscapes to searching intentions. And intentions, unlike buildings, leave no ruins. They fade only if forgotten. Here, forgetting may have been the final layer of protection. If the vaults were never found, it may be because they were entrusted to a memory designed not to survive scrutiny, or perhaps not to survive at all. After the trials ended and the sentences were carried out, something unexpected happened. Or rather, something did not happen. The records did not fill in the gaps. They did not resolve the questions that had justified the arrests in the first place. Instead, they taper off thin and uncurious, as if the matter had exhausted itself without ever being concluded. A well-established historical fact sets the tone here. Royal and ecclesiastical archives that should document the transfer and redistribution of confiscated Templar assets contain remarkably little detail beyond the immediate aftermath of the arrests. There are receipts for buildings. There are notes on revenues redirected to other orders. What is missing is any clear account of a great financial windfall. For an operation supposedly motivated by greed and debt, the paper trail is strangely modest. An obscure but persistent detail lies in the way some records simply stop. Series of entries end mid-topic. Inventories are referenced but never reproduced. Correspondence alludes to earlier lists that no longer exist. Scholars disagree on whether this reflects deliberate suppression or simple administrative fatigue. Medieval archives were not designed for future historians, and losses are common. Yet the pattern here feels too consistent to dismiss entirely. You may recall how earlier inventories felt incomplete, how auditors seemed content to move on. That same energy carries forward into the archival silence. Once the order was dissolved, the urgency evaporated. Officials no longer needed to justify searches. The absence of treasure became an inconvenience best forgotten. Silence once again proves easier than explanation. Some historians argue that records were intentionally pared down to avoid exposing the Crown's disappointment. Admitting that the expected wealth was not recovered would have undermined the moral framing of the trials. Others counter that bureaucratic systems naturally simplify once their primary goal is achieved. The open question remains unresolved, suspended between embarrassment and indifference. A gentle callback hums beneath this debate, returning you to the idea of planned secrecy. If assets were never meant to surface, then archives would reflect that absence. You cannot document what you never touch. The lack of evidence becomes evidence of restraint rather than loss. This inversion is uncomfortable, but it fits the pattern that has emerged again and again. There is also the matter of redistribution. Properties transferred to successor orders, particularly the Hospitallers, do not appear to bring sudden prosperity. Their records show continuity rather than transformation. If vast hidden reserves had been discovered and absorbed, one might expect a noticeable shift. Instead, the transition looks administrative, almost boring. History's quietest clue is often boredom. A light, sleepy joke slips in here, because the tone allows it. Imagine inheriting a house rumored to contain a fortune only to receive the house and none of the fortune. You might eventually stop mentioning the rumor altogether. Archives, like people, get tired of being disappointed. Another obscure point of debate concerns later attempts to audit former Templar lands. In some regions, secondary reviews were conducted years after the dissolution. They uncovered nothing new, no late discoveries, no accidental breakthroughs. The silence persisted, reinforcing the sense that whatever was missing was never going to wander into daylight on its own. Critics of vault theories argue that absence in the archives proves absence in reality. Supporters respond that archives reflect what authorities controlled, not what they failed to grasp. Both positions have merit. Yet when combined with the architectural, behavioral, and logistical patterns you have already traced, the archival quiet begins to look less like a gap and more like a boundary. As you sit with this, the pace naturally slows. Paper rustles, candles burn low, scribes move on to other matters. The Templars, once the focus of obsession, fade into administrative background noise. And in that fading, the unanswered questions remain untouched. The investigation has now reached a strange plateau. Not a revelation, but a realization. If vaults were never found, it may be because the story ended before it could be written down. The archives do not shout secrets. They whisper omissions, and omissions, when repeated consistently across time and institutions, are rarely accidental. They are the shadow left behind when something important was never meant to cast light. By the time the order faded from living memory, the search for its missing wealth had already begun to take on a life of its own. Curiosity hardened into obsession. Obsession drifted toward certainty. And certainty, when unsupported, has a habit of latching on to the wrong places. This is where the investigation grows slippery, because not every site long associated with hidden vaults deserves the attention it has received. A well-established historical fact provides the necessary anchor. From the late Middle Ages onward, numerous locations across Europe were rumored to conceal Templar treasure, yet none produced verifiable discoveries tied directly to the order. Despite centuries of digging speculation and occasional destruction, not a single site has yielded uncontested evidence of a recovered Templar vault. That failure, repeated across generations, is itself a pattern. An obscure but revealing detail lies in how many of these sites share similar features. They are visually striking. They possess dramatic ruins, unusual carvings, or symbolic ornamentation that invites interpretation. They are also places that were already famous or mysterious for other reasons. Scholars have noted that such locations attract projection. People search where stories feel right, not where logistics point. This distinction matters more than it seems. You may recall the earlier suggestion that conspicuous sites can function as distractions. Here, that idea sharpens. If the order wished to ensure that nothing truly important was found, encouraging attention toward obvious locations would have been remarkably effective. Even unintentionally, architectural drama can become a decoy. The more compelling the surface, the less likely observers are to look elsewhere. Some historians argue that the proliferation of treasure legends proves there was nothing to hide, that imagination rushed in to fill the vacuum left by absence. Others counter that legends often grow around deliberate misdirection. The open question remains unresolved, yet the consistency with which searches have failed suggests that attention has been repeatedly guided away from whatever mattered most. A soft callback settles in here, linking back to the Paris Temple. Its symbolic weight drew generations of scrutiny, yet yielded nothing. Rural houses, by contrast, attracted little myth and less digging. The imbalance is telling. Decoys work best when they feel important enough to deserve obsession. Quiet places rarely earn that honor. There is also the matter of timing. Many so-called treasure sites became popular only centuries after the order's fall. By then, original contexts were lost, and reinterpretation flourished. Symbols were reread. Shadows became passages. Ordinary cellars became vaults. This does not invalidate curiosity, but it does complicate claims of continuity. A light, dry humor drifts through the narrative here. Imagine leaving behind a puzzle where the wrong answer is far more interesting than the right one. People would spend centuries admiring the distraction, congratulating themselves on proximity, while remaining comfortably distant from the truth. Another obscure detail emerges in early modern writings that casually dismiss earlier treasure hunts as foolish. These authors did not deny the order's wealth. They simply doubted it would be found where everyone was looking. Their skepticism feels less arrogant and more resigned, as if they understood something had been misplaced deliberately, not lost accidentally. Critics of decoy theories argue that they attribute too much foresight to medieval actors. They suggest that later generations simply overinterpreted ruins. This criticism has weight, yet it struggles to account for the repeated failure of searches in places that should statistically have produced something by now. Absence on this scale invites explanation. As the investigation deepens, a subtle realization forms. False trails do not require active deception. They require predictability. Humans search where drama suggests reward. They follow symbols, not spreadsheets. The order trained in logistics rather than legend would have understood this instinctively. The open scholarly debate now circles one quiet question. If decoys existed, were they intentional or accidental? Were certain sites designed to draw attention? Or did attention simply settle where it felt most satisfying? The answer may never be clear. What matters is the effect. Generations of effort expended. Nothing recovered. As you rest with this, the pace softens again. Shovels pause, maps fold. The ground remains undisturbed elsewhere. The investigation does not accuse treasure hunters of foolishness. It gently suggests they were looking exactly where history expected them to look. And expectation, once set, becomes a guide more powerful than any map. The vaults, if they exist, have survived not because they are hidden well, but because attention has been directed elsewhere with remarkable consistency. At some point, the question shifts again, almost imperceptibly. It is no longer about where the vaults might be, but why, if they ever existed, none were ever reopened. Centuries have passed. Regimes have changed. Stones have been turned for far less compelling reasons, and yet no credible account exists of a hidden Templar vault being accessed after the order's fall. That silence demands explanation. A well-established historical fact anchors this moment. From the 14th century onward, Europe experienced repeated waves of construction war and redevelopment that exposed countless medieval foundations. Churches were rebuilt, castles were dismantled, fields were plowed deeper than ever before. In other contexts, such activity routinely uncovered hoards, caches, and forgotten chambers. The absence of confirmed Templar vault discoveries during this period is statistically striking. One obscure but important detail appears in how medieval hoards are usually found. Most are discovered accidentally during building or farming, and quickly enter legal or ecclesiastical records due to disputes over ownership. These disputes generate paperwork. In the case of the Templars, no such disputes exist, not even contested ones. Scholars debate whether this means there was nothing to find, or whether what existed was placed so deliberately that chance never touched it. A soft callback returns you to the earlier discussion of rural commanderies. If vaults were integrated beneath ordinary structures and sealed permanently, then later builders might never have recognized them as distinct spaces. A filled-in chamber looks like bedrock once enough time passes. Without knowledge of its existence, no one thinks to question it. The door does not wait. It disappears. Another line of debate focuses on intent. Some historians argue that vaults were designed to be reopened by a surviving remnant of the order. When that remnant failed to materialize, the vault simply remained closed. Others suggest a more radical idea: that reopening was never the goal, that certain assets were removed from circulation entirely sacrificed to stability rather than preserved for recovery. This interpretation is controversial, yet it aligns with the order's emphasis on stewardship over possession. There is also the human factor of memory. Even well-kept secrets rely on continuity. The inner circle you considered earlier was small, and its members did not survive long after the trials. Knowledge unpassed becomes knowledge lost. This possibility feels less dramatic than hidden maps and coded instructions, but it may be more realistic. The vaults, if they exist, may be victims of their own success. A light, almost sleepy humor slips in here. Imagine locking something away so securely that even you cannot remember where you put it. The system works perfectly, just not in the way originally intended. Another obscure detail worth noting is the absence of late medieval claims. People claimed many things in the centuries that followed, from royal bloodlines to miraculous relics. Yet credible claims of reopening Templar vaults are conspicuously absent. Silence once again proves consistent across time, which makes it harder to attribute to coincidence. Critics argue that this absence is precisely the problem. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Without discoveries, the vaults remain hypothetical. Supporters respond that the investigation is not built on imagination alone, but on patterns of absence, design, and behavior that converge repeatedly. The open question remains unresolved, balanced between skepticism and cumulative inference. As you sit with this realization, the atmosphere grows still. The drama of searching fades. What remains is acceptance of limits. Not all questions were meant to be answered. Not all doors were meant to open again. The order may have built something that succeeded too well, outlasting the very people who understood it. The investigation has now reached a quiet turning point. If no vault was ever reopened, it may be because reopening required something that vanished with the order itself. Not courage, not resources, but knowledge deliberately constrained and ultimately extinguished. And so the vaults, if they are there, remain untouched, not because no one has tried hard enough, but because the conditions for discovery were never meant to survive the fall. By now, the investigation has shed much of its romance. What remains is quieter, narrower, and therefore more convincing. The question is no longer where treasure hunters have looked, but where silence, logistics, and indifference intersect. If vaults were never found, the places most likely to conceal them are not dramatic. They are forgettable. A well-established historical fact frames this narrowing of focus. Templar properties were overwhelmingly practical in nature, chosen for access to land roads and resources rather than symbolism. When combined with the order's preference for durability and discretion, this suggests that any long-term concealment would favor locations that continued to function normally after the order's fall. A place that remains useful attracts maintenance, not excavation, and maintenance preserves secrets. Scholars who approach the mystery conservatively tend to converge on similar criteria rather than specific sites. The most plausible locations are those that changed ownership, smoothly continued agricultural or religious use, and never attracted scandal or redevelopment intense enough to expose foundations. An obscure but telling detail is that many former Templar lands passed quietly into new hands with no recorded disputes over hidden assets. In medieval Europe, silence during transfer is unusual. Here it is consistent. A soft callback surfaces, drawing you back to rural commanderies and their orderly emptiness. Fields plowed year after year. Chapels repaired rather than rebuilt. Cellars reused without curiosity. These are not places that invite discovery. They are places that absorb change without revealing layers. If a sealed chamber lay beneath such a site, time would protect it better than any guard. Another area of scholarly debate centers on depth. Medieval builders did not dig unnecessarily deep. Vaults meant for permanence would have been placed just far enough below disturbance, but not so far as to complicate construction. This creates a narrow band of concealment that modern development often bypasses. Pipes, foundations, and trenches either skim above it or cut far below. The sweet spot remains untouched. This idea is speculative, but it helps explain why centuries of activity have produced nothing. You might notice how anticlimactic this feels, and that is important. The most plausible locations do not come with legends attached. They do not sit beneath ruined towers or dramatic cliffs. They lie under places that never stopped being useful. A working farm is rarely excavated beyond necessity. A functioning monastery is repaired, not gutted. Normality becomes camouflage. A light, drowsy joke drifts through the thought. Imagine hiding something in the one place no one ever thinks to search. Somewhere boring. Somewhere productive. Somewhere that inspires absolutely no documentaries until now. Critics of this narrowing argue that it explains too much by explaining too little. If everything could hide a vault, then nothing is proven. Supporters respond that this is precisely the point. The strength of the strategy lies in how unremarkable it is. The order did not need cleverness. It needed patience and predictability. Another obscure consideration involves legal continuity. Some former Templar properties remained under religious stewardship for centuries. Excavation in such contexts was rare and often discouraged. Sacred ground resists curiosity. This resistance may be cultural rather than intentional, but its effect is the same. What lies beneath remains beneath. As you rest with this, the investigation feels almost complete. The search has not identified a single door to open. It has identified a pattern of doors that no one ever thought to look for. Silence, continuity, usefulness. These are not exciting qualities. They are durable ones. The open scholarly question persists, but it has narrowed. Are the vaults still physically intact beneath ordinary places, or were they dismantled unknowingly over time? The evidence leans gently toward survival not because of strength, but because of neglect. Neglect once again proves to be history's most reliable shield. You are left with a calm, almost meditative conclusion. If the vaults were never found, it is because they were hidden where discovery would never feel necessary. Not lost to chaos, not protected by legend, simply left alone. And sometimes that is the most secure place of all. Now the search slows to its natural end. Not with a discovery, not with a door opening somewhere beneath stone, but with a realization settling gently into place. The Knights Templar did not fail to protect their vaults. They succeeded too well. When you gather everything you have followed, the thin inventories, the empty houses, the careful architecture, the disciplined silence, the absence in archives, the failure of every dramatic search, a single shape emerges. Not chaos, not loss, design. A design that did not depend on any one place, any one person, or even the survival of the order itself. The most convincing theory is also the least romantic. The vaults were never meant to be found, because they were never meant to be reopened. They were not emergency safes waiting for a triumphant return. They were final acts of stewardship. Assets removed from circulation so they could no longer distort power, provoke kings, or justify violence. In a world where wealth repeatedly triggered catastrophe, disappearance may have felt like responsibility rather than defeat. You can feel how this reframes everything. The inner circle did not guard a secret so it could be reclaimed. They guarded it so it could be forgotten. Knowledge was limited. Locations were unmarked. Memory itself was allowed to fade. What remained was stability purchased at the cost of mystery. This is why the vaults leave no echo, no late confessions, no accidental discoveries, no triumphant unearthing. Silence was not a failure of history. It was the intended outcome. The order built systems that survived pressure by becoming invisible. And invisibility, once achieved, does not announce itself when it works. There is something oddly calming about that thought. No frantic rush, no last-minute escape. Just a slow, deliberate closing of doors, followed by centuries of ordinary life passing overhead. Fields plowed, chapels repaired, roads rerouted. The world moved on, never needing to know what lay beneath. If you listen closely, you might even hear the faint humor of it. Generations searching for glitter and spectacle while the real achievement was boredom. Continuity. Places so unremarkable they never earned suspicion. It is the kind of strategy only patient people attempt, and only disciplined ones can complete. As your breathing evens out, the story loosens its grip. The vaults do not demand belief. They do not ask to be proven. They simply remain possible, which may be the most honest ending history can offer. Some secrets are not hidden behind puzzles. They are hidden behind time. So you let the search fade. The stone grows quiet. The unanswered question softens into something gentler, almost reassuring. Not everything lost is meant to be recovered. Not everything hidden is waiting to be found. And somewhere beneath ordinary ground, whether real or imagined, the vaults rest in perfect darkness, doing exactly what they were built to do.